The 296th Regiment in Champagne, July 13th, August 29th, 1916. Nevertheless, you could tell that the Slavic soldiers I met in the streets of Bui had had something other than tea, their customary beverage, to drink. They zigzagged in a manner which was dangerous to their equilibrium, and some of them, gesticulating, singing, stopped women and girls in the streets, kneeling comically before them to give them what was no doubt an elaborate declaration of love, in the form of raucous sounds interrupted with hiccups. Indulgent and amused, the men and women of Bui formed circles around these harmless drunkards. I'll pass over without comment the next day, July 14th, Bastille Day, the French national holiday. Only a supplemental ration of pinard and a slightly better bill of fare, which was more than made up for in the following week, barely distinguished this day from any other. We didn't even get any extra rest. In fact, our training course, which could hardly be postponed, began that very day. They introduced us to this new homicidal engine. Most of us couldn't hold back a frown of disdain. It was a minuscule cannon, a 75 in miniature, a child's toy. Its shell was barely bigger than a hen's egg. The instructors waxed elegiac about this cannon, praising its precision, its rapidity of fire, and the penetrating power of the shells. This was the 37mm cannon, intended to destroy machine gun nests, observation posts, etc. I will spare the reader the various exercises, test firings and lectures on theory which transformed us into brilliant cannoneers in 12 days. And to think that the old farts at headquarters claimed before the war that 2 years were insufficient time to make a perfect artilleryman. After the war, they will be capable of picking the topic up again. The daily lectures on theory pretty much limited themselves to stuffing our heads with what is a point, a line, an angle. After the 100 times or so which our instructors repeated it, we ended up knowing that a point is the intersection of two lines, and a line is the limit of two planes. As for the definitions of various angles, 1,000th, and various other geometrical expressions, a dozen brains out of 30 refused to record in their grey matter cells these two monotonous words. A comical note was provided by a corporal from the 114th Regiment who could never pronounce certain words correctly. For example, when it was his turn, he called out capacity fire instead of efficiency fire. In vain did the poor fellow make a violent effort to say it correctly, but when he was halfway through, his tongue would make a wrong turn, and the command would come out as tir de capacité to everyone's pitiless laughter. Only I didn't laugh, because I was afflicted by a sudden and untimely indisposition. I completely lost my appetite, and for 2 days I had all the trouble in the world standing up on my 2 legs. My eyes reddened and burned, spots broke out on my throat, a lip swelled up. I no longer looked like a Christian. I should have gone to sick bay, but the irritated instructor lieutenant said that I would have to travel several kilometres to find an infirmary and a medical officer, and given the short stay I'd have at Bui, I'd be better off sticking it out to the end, according to the expression in fashion then. And that's what I resigned myself to do, with the local water of dubious potability being the only thing my stomach would accept. One evening, feeling a little better, with my gastronomical equipment having shown some hints of an appetite, I decided to try the journey to Mourmelon-le-Grand in order to provision myself. They said it would take about a half hour. It was on the other side of a bare hill. But behind this hill there was another, then 2 or 3 more, and finally it took me more than 4 hours to reach Mourmelon, where I arrived in a state of complete exhaustion. The presence in this village of Russian troops and a number of support services of the French army made this locale quite lively. By unexpected luck, I found a restaurant where they squeezed every bit out of your pocketbook, but where I could, to my great benefit, get served 2 eggs, a salad, and some fruit. By the end of this frugal meal, twilight had fallen, and I hastened to take up the road back to camp. But I was held back a while by the spectacle of a Russian regiment leaving for relief on the front line. The men marched in ranks of 10 or 12, as wide as the roadway. They had a slow pace, and at the lead of their officers they intoned hymns borrowed from religious settings like canticles. At the front of the companies, little Russians of 10 to 15 years kept the pace and sang their heads off, mixing their shrill voices with the deep ones of their elders, whose adopted children they were. They carried out the functions of couriers, cyclists, drummer boys, pot scrubbers, etc. Once I got back on the road, night enveloped the deserted steps of the Comte de Chalon with an opaque darkness, and despite having noted a few landmarks on my journey there, I got lost, and soon, completely at the end of my strength, I passed out on the ground. With no sense of suffering, like a lamp which goes out at its last drop of oil, I lost all thought of earthly things, and I felt myself slipping into the oblivion of death. But perhaps I was destined for a more glorious end, one worthy of envy, as Victor Hugo said, like, for example, being pounded, shredded, asphyxiated, blown to bits in a cloud of smoke. The coolness of the evening revived me, and at about 11 o'clock, after many rest stops and detours, I arrived back at the barracks where we were lodged. My absence had gone almost unnoticed due to incidents which had occurred during the evening. At Bouy, in a tavern, a quarrel had broken out between some soldiers from the 296th Regiment and some grenadiers and soldiers from some other regiments. The reasons for it were the same as always: antagonism, indeed hatred, between the Midi and other parts of France. These sentiments, always regrettable in their latent state, sometimes came to the fore when a few bottles of wine heated up the heads of the descendants of the Visigoths and those of the Franks. Usually these were limited to unpleasant insinuations, sometimes rising to the level of insults, but this time it was more serious. There were fisticuffs exchanged, even clubs wielded, if you please, and blood flowed. One of the Franks was literally knocked out, while two Visigoths from the 296th had their faces pounded into marmalade. A general brawl had ensued, and in the barracks where we slept on a single long camp bed, there was a storm raging in the air, even though the most passionate combatants belonged to another billet. As an isolated minority, we were subjected to stupid provocations, insinuations, mockeries, shouted insults, and stone-throwing. We met all of this with scornful silence and went to bed. But they burst in and started jumping and dancing on the boards of the camp bed and forced us to get up. In the face of this harassment, we picked up our blankets and went to sleep outside, under a beautiful, starry July sky. On July 21st, the eve of our departure, all the regiments of the Fourth Army sent to Bouy a whole slew of commandants and captains, summoned to witness the new formation of combat companies, composed of teams of grenadiers, machine gunners, bomb throwers, 37mm cannons, etc. General Gouraud, missing an arm and a leg, chief of the Fourth Army, was there. He looked quite no nonsense, this general. Around him swarmed officers bedecked with ribbons and medals, who made themselves as stiff and attentive before their chief as they would be arrogant toward a subordinate. Our demonstration drills of attacking and defending a trench were crowned with success, as they always were on manoeuvres. Our firing onto targets which we'd carefully plotted out the night before were naturally deemed to be marvellous in their precision. All those present were astounded, or pretended to be. Then we listened raptly to the warlike thunderings of General Gouraud. The Pope delivering a sermon at St. Peter's could not have been listened to more respectfully than the general was by this crowd. I could hear a cricket singing. Amazingly, I actually heard a few bits and pieces of the speech. A simple corporal couldn't make his way up to the front row and plant himself right under the nose of such a lofty personage. The rifle was obsolete, he said, and would have to be relegated to the Museum of Prehistoric Arms. We weren't killing men one by one anymore. Let's talk about grenades, bombs, flamethrowers, machine guns, etc. With all that at our disposal, we'd soon have the Boches on the run. General Gouraud was sure of it. Besides, in a confidential tone, he repeated the words of the Spanish ambassador in Berlin, that if the French knew the state of exhaustion and discouragement of the German people, we would be waving banners of joy. He must have been very well informed, this ambassador, or else he was making fun of us. At the end, the general said the Battle of the Somme was at full force, and that the Fourth Army would soon be taking its turn and claiming its share of glory. We didn't doubt the accuracy of this promise. The officers applauded, displayed a real enthusiasm about leading us, and then disappeared, carried off by automobiles in every direction, while we, under a leaden sun, made our way back to the Ferme de Bouy, painfully dragging our cannon along. The next day, July 22nd, We left the Ferme de Bouilly to rejoin our regiment, which, since the 17th, had been on the front lines near the Butte de Tahur. A truck took us to the train station at Saint-Hilaire-au-Temple. The train took us to Sweep, and then our own legs took us to the divisional depot not far from Somme-Sweep, where we arrived after the evening meal was over. And since the offerings there weren't very abundant, we didn't even have any leftovers for our supper, nor a corner to lie down in. I had to sleep under a cart. That doesn't say much about the hospitality at the divisional depot. Our Lieutenant Lorius had led us to believe that, as guardians of the secrets of manipulating this new cannon, our persons became precious, and that they would no doubt keep us at the depot to preserve us from the numerous risks of a soldier's trade. No such luck. The commandant of the depot handed down the order for us to rejoin our respective units at daybreak the next day. As badly fed and lodged as we were at the depot, we'd have rather spent a few more days there. But the next day at dawn, we set out on our way, a journey with no charms across the desert of the Champagne Pouilleuse, which a few clumps of stunted pines weren't able to enliven. At nightfall, I finally reached an outpost where I found my squad of hooligans, who welcomed me not with cries of joy, the Boches were a few paces away, but by other displays of friendship which touched me. Worn down with fatigue, I stretched out on the outpost's firing step, hoping that the Boches wouldn't pay us a visit that night, given the impossibility of my defending myself, or clearing out, or keeping up if they hauled me back with them. By half-section, the two squads spent 24 hours watching our neighbours across the way, and 24 hours in a hole in the front line. This would have been fine if the reliefs had taken place at dawn or at twilight, but instead they took place at midnight. So we all had 2 nights split in half, instead of 1 full night's sleep. But someone had said midnight to midnight, just as easily as saying noon to noon. Who was responsible for this? A colonel? A commandant? A captain? These people lived too close to us, and too far away. Too far to bother with such small details, they could sleep as much as they wanted. But if a lowly private feels tempted to fall asleep, he has the prospect of a court-martial to keep him wide awake. What kind of nonsense was this, to put a whole squad into an outpost, which was simply the front end of a sap, where we were all piled up on top of each other? One shell, or a mortar round, or a simple grenade could have killed all of the occupants. Couldn't they have put 2 sentries on duty, and the others a little bit to the rear, in a shelter, where they could have mounted some resistance to an attack? But let's not be too demanding, when we've been at war for only 2 years. Everything can't be perfect. And after all, if a mortar round kills 2 men or a dozen, what difference does that make? Back there is the divisional depot which can disgorge brave men, eager for the honour of coming up to the front line, as the newspapers said. We weren't yet having manpower shortages. Lord knows we'd have a victory before that happened. Therefore at midnight they came to relieve us, and 5 minutes later we were at the rest shelter dugout, not very deep, but with 2 entry points. The floor was laid with planks, which might appear to be a luxury. These planks served us as mattress and pillow. This was a comfort, considering that up to now we had slept on the damp earth. For those who envy us this well-being, it needs to be said that legions of lice and fleas had already chosen this floor as their domicile. Furthermore, these rough planks, simply laid next to each other by a clumsy carpenter on uneven ground, were like piano keys, so that when you were lying down and a comrade came into the shelter, you wouldn't be surprised to have your shoulder, your head, or your flank be bounced up while your other shoulder or flank sank down. One would think that once we got to the shelter, all we did was unpack our blankets, stretch out under them, blow out our candles, and revel in a well-earned sleep while lice and fleas jammed their suckers into our bodies. But the fear of poison gas was like a new sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of the trench dwellers, from which came the necessity of mounting guard duty by a watcher who would be relieved each hour in front of the shelter. This was easier said than done. Nobody wanted to be first. Everybody came up with a reason which appeared irrefutable, leading to endless palaver. Our squad had the bad luck of being closest to the crossroads of communication trenches leading to the outpost. There was set up a periscope, the upper mirror of which was affixed to the top end of a fake tree trunk, which rotated in all directions. It allowed us to admire the charming lunar landscape which surrounded us. There were also signal flares, and also the shelter of the section chief, who slept more peacefully when he knew there was a sentry in front of his abode, a sentry which my squad had to supply night and day. Furthermore, we were always available for work details at anyone's pleasure. It was rare that 2 hours went by without a liaison man, or the sergeant coming and pulling you from your sleep to tell the corporal to furnish 1, 2, or 3 men to go resupply our grenades, bombs, flares, cartridges, sandbags. Sometimes the corporal is sent along too. You can understand how the choice of these men for work detail didn't happen without protests or complaints by those who were designated. Each night we also had to send out a work detail for water for the command post of the captain or the commandant. There weren't any Wallace fountains in the trenches, and we sometimes had to cover some kilometres to reach the terminus of the tacos, narrow-gauge railroad trains, which brought up the water in kegs. The poilu often doesn't have a drop of water to quench his thirst, but Messieurs les officiers and even their orderlies, the rationers and other do-nothings are keen on doing their daily ablutions with plenty of water. Of course, the poilu coming back from outpost duty would much prefer taking a snooze to hauling a barrel or a big keg of water on his shoulders, in gloomy communication trenches where he would sometimes lose his way. But if he grumbled a bit, or even a lot, he obeyed all the same. Add to this the fact that each hour, the sentries on duty at the periscope and at the shelter's entrance came in to wake up their relievers a good 10 minutes early, and the latter, knowing what was coming, turned a deaf ear to them, so obliging themselves to be summoned 3 and 4 times, with increasing loudness, so that everyone was forced to wake up as well. During the day you couldn't think of getting any shut-eye. There was coffee, meals, letters to read and write, work details, and the boyau and dugout area to keep in a state of propriety in anticipation of an inspection or of the colonel passing by, or a general, which hardly ever happened but which our captain was always anticipating. This first night, after establishing the roster of sentries and picking a work detail for duckboard duty, I thought I might try to get some sleep. Not so fast. I was almost immediately awakened by a rough, surly voice at the top of the stairs, passing the order to the corporal to come up to the surface, as quick as it takes to say these words. It was Lieutenant so-and-so from company such-and-such who was making his rounds, and he had just surprised the sentry at the periscope, a young Breton fast asleep on duty, perhaps dreaming about his peaceful Brittany and his pretty little Breton girlfriend, whose picture he had so proudly shown me as soon as I'd arrived. The situation was serious. The officer could have easily held me responsible for it. The guilty party was right there, overwhelmed. He could have claimed that, even if he had succumbed to sleeplessness and fatigue, those most guilty were perhaps those who either didn't know how, or else didn't want, to give men like him sufficient time off for sleep. But the poor boy didn't think to claim extenuating circumstances. He might have made things even worse. Timidly I invoked his young age, his fatigue, his status as an orphan, and finally that he was at this post more as an orderly than as a sentry. But the officer cut short my pleading. "We'll see about that," he said dryly as he left. This was not a minor infraction, as the next day the military hierarchy got word of the call for punishment brought by this officer. What? A front-line sentry who couldn't resist sleepiness? What exemplary punishment were they going to inflict on him? Prison? But all the sentries were likely to fall asleep in order to get out of the trenches to where there was shelter from shells, poison gas, lice, cold, rain, no matter how dark and gloomy the prison cell. The only suitable punishment was death. Nevertheless, he was not stood up and shot. They were not so ferocious at this point, or rather they wanted his death to fit into their plans. Getting ready to launch a poison gas attack, for which we had recently dug some earthworks, they set up in the regiment a free section, charged with going out and exploring the German lines right after the emission. Would this gas strangle the Boches halfway, or 3/4, or all the way? Or would it just make them sneeze? That's what we needed to know. A dangerous curiosity, because we couldn't expect much of a welcome. And we could be asphyxiated by our own gas, in spite of the special gas masks they gave us, of always dubious effectiveness. These men were to be sacrificed, in a sense. Those being punished for some grave infraction of discipline were chosen automatically. There were also some volunteers lured by the promise of home leave, or a croix de guerre, or stripes on their sleeves. Maurice Eva went to bolster the number of these volunteers, and left the squad for the moment to go off for training in this famous free section near the colonel's command post. He was also favoured with 2 weeks of prison, for the principle of it, the rest being no more than a means of rehabilitation. The next day at midnight, our squad headed out to occupy an outpost which was different from the one where we had been the night before. At daybreak, the sentry who was watching the periscope, which was hidden behind a high clump of grass, signalled me frantically to come up. I looked in the mirror and was stupefied to see a German's head reflected in it, a neck like a bull's, a big square head, a thick red mop of hair, a bestial look all enough to give you nightmares. This apparition was coming out of the earth, barely 4 or 5 metres from us, into our own barbed wire which surrounded our outpost, without the slightest shovelful of disturbed earth to indicate that there was any sort of trench or excavation around him. Evidently this was not a mirage. The Germans must have dug a subterranean passage, carrying back to the rear the dirt they removed. The sentry took a grenade and was about to toss it at this intruder, looking at me for approval. I held his arm. I will always be faithful to my principles as a socialist, a humanitarian, even a true Christian, even if they cost me my life, of not firing on someone unless in legitimate self-defence. And was it in our interest to break the neighbourly relations which existed between our 2 adjoining outposts? If this Lascar is poking his head up only out of curiosity, I said to my comrades in a low voice, that's all the same to us. If he is coming to check out our position in order to send over a couple of grenades, we'll open our eyes so that he doesn't show us his big square head again, or we'll make it round for him. The following night passed without incident, but it was a very black night. The wind rattled the barbed wire, and the rats danced a wild farandole out there. The daylight apparition of the big square head, the discovery of the underground passage emerging so close to us, all this impressed my little rookies, and on several occasions they started to toss grenades and take pot shots. Their imaginations made them see big square heads on all sides. Each time I had to call a ceasefire. It risked raising a general alarm in the whole sector. On July 26th at 11 p.m, we were relieved, and 7 kilometres to the rear we took possession of some barracks set up in a pinewoods clearing. This was Camp A. The landscape had nothing to commend it, right in the midst of the lousy Champagne. Some scraggy pines, bare clearings, ravines and valleys with no streams or meadows. In normal times, only a few misanthropic crows and solitary rats inhabited these places, as sad as the confines of the desert. These barracks enclosed 2 big camp beds, one superimposed above the other. The first who entered took, by right, the ground level, and I, being among the latecomers, had to install myself on the top story, or rather the top shelf. To get up there required a vigorous effort of the forearms. The young rookies scrambled up like cats. As for me, I could haul myself up only with the help of an obliging neighbour. Apart from that, and the freezing cold nights and broiling hot days, it could have been worse. A few 100 metres away, at the bottom of a ravine, were the ruins of the forester's cabin, made famous by the fighting around it during the 1915 offensive. After the war, the forester who occupied it could also take on the additional job of cemetery keeper, to take care of the grave sites which spread like vineyards along the slopes of the ravine. The whole lousy Champagne isn't worth 1 drop of the precious blood which was spilled to conquer this bit of desert. At the bottom of this ravine I saw, under a sort of hangar covered with foliage, a row of half hogsheads, each with a big wooden spigot. Was this a wine merchant boldly setting up shop within range of shell fire? No, this was a watering post, and these kegs were more often empty than full. They didn't give out water to just any passer-by. Only a regular work detail with a non-com bearing a written order could come and partake of it. Although you could quench your thirst there, you couldn't get water to clean the mud and the lice out of your clothes. For that you had to bribe the territorial on guard duty in front of the barrels, or distract him, which could be done only at night, if at all. Well, you didn't need a 100-franc note or even a tenner to purchase the territorial's compliance. For me, all that was needed was a 3-sou cigar to get him to turn his back while I filled a canvas bucket, which was all I needed to do my laundry. In this camp, there was no way to get anything to eat. The food cooperatives were only in the planning stage, and the truck gardeners didn't risk coming up this close to the front lines. A jug of coffee, a jug of wine for a drink, the meagre company mess for food, that was all. We were in the same state as an army under siege, except for Messieurs les officiers who, through their rationers, lacked neither the necessities nor the luxuries. Certain desert animals have the gift of finding water, I don't know how many leagues away. Similarly, the poilus could sniff out Pinard at a great distance. From early on they could discern the wine of the merchants of Suippes, Somme-Suippes and other places. Right away you'd see poilus heading out, with a dozen jerrycans suspended from their shoulders in search of the precious liquid. But alas, at every turn of the pathway or at each crossroads, the vigilant policemen, real head-knockers, would pitilessly send them back, after having carefully taken down their names and serial numbers. And each day, at roll call, there'd be a torrent of prison days raining down on those who were naive enough to think that, fighting for the liberty of peoples, they could have the liberty to go buy a jerrycan of wine or a piece of cheese. A corporal from my company, having decided to go to Somme-Suippes, thought himself clever enough to make up a false authorization which he signed by his own hand, with the name of the company commandant. But the gendarmes who stopped him got suspicious and sent this permission slip to the division, which sent it to the colonel and finally to the captain, and the trick was discovered. This corporal was in a real mess. No one talked of anything less than a court-martial, breaking in rank, forced labour. I don't know how he pulled himself out of it. But this zeal in carrying out such a rigorous and absurd duty irritated the poilus, who went out in groups and administered some hard knocks to the gendarmes with stout clubs. But these reprisals went too far. One day they found 2 gendarmes swinging from the branches of a pine tree, with their tongues hanging out. From this moment, the poilus could go get food in the neighbourhood without worrying about a thing. Far up the chain of command, they were moved by this incident. At roll call, for 3 days straight, they read and reread a note from the general-en-chef, praising the tough and thankless job that the brave gendarmes carry out, earning the respect of all. The officers couldn't repress the guffaws and sarcastic comments which welcomed this reading. "If they find their jobs too tough and thankless," said a voice, "then they should come up to an outpost one time." It's too bad that the generals didn't attend, incognito, the readings of their notes to the troops. They would soon be edified about the judgment brought upon them and their flowery words by the soldiers in their good common sense. We spent only 4 days at Camp A. The last day, a couple of shells landed 200 or 300 metres away. It's clear that the Germans weren't just trying to bust up a few pine trees. They knew about the camp, and it was just a miscalculation in their aim, which kept us from having some casualties. On July 30th, after the evening meal and in a suffocating heat, we went up to the front line as reserves, near the tragically famous Trou Bricot. There was no shortage of shelters. In fact, there were too many to choose from. Before our 1915 offensive, the Germans had installed their reserves there, and you could still see the emplacement of a monumental water pump, protected by a reinforced concrete shelter. We saw near our shelter a mine crater where a battalion could have been hidden. There had been quite a struggle for control of this crater. Debris of all kinds, grenades, barbed wire, broken weapons, all attested to it. But each of us passed by indifferently. It was only an insignificant episode, a tiny detail in the great drama. These places in particular were infested with rats, who came, according to their habits, to rob our haversacks, and at night time to drag their muzzles, their paws and their tails across our sleeping faces. You can imagine the disgust which these detestable rodents inspired in us when we learned that they lived in a nearby cemetery for German soldiers. Each grave site was honeycombed with their burrows, and the sickening odour which escaped from this cemetery left no doubt that these rats were devouring the cadavers. Once the contents of our haversacks and the various cast-offs of a troop stationed nearby ceased to be enough for their nourishment. By day they dwelt among the dead, and by night among us the living. What charming neighbours! Day and night teams of men took turns going up to the front line, putting themselves in the hands of the engineers for mine tunnelling duty. Others more qualified than I will someday tell the story about these mines, with their damp, narrow, gloomy subterranean communication trenches. Perhaps they will calculate what amount of work they involved, how much effort, how much fatigue, suffering and sleeplessness. Will they be able to add up the staggering bill? The Canal des Deux Mers probably will have cost significantly fewer swings of a pickaxe. When it was my turn, I went up with my squad to this project worthy of a team of convicts. Our task consisted of transporting heavy loads of construction material, planks, beams, crates of powder up to the mine entrances, then working right behind the miners, filling up sacks with stones which they dug out and dragging them back to a landing from where a wagon pulled by a winch lifted them up and away from the mine entrance, where others disposed of the contents by spreading them out at night time, outside the trenches. There were stretches of tunnel where you couldn't pass through without bending over and walking on your knees. Dripping with sweat, worn out, the men passed the sacks from one to another, which sometimes took 20 minutes to reach the mouth, because some of the galleries were several hundred metres long. One night, with my squad, I found myself about 50 metres underground when, relayed from mouth to mouth, the terrible cry of "Gas alert" reached us. The result was a headlong flight to the mine's entrance, but in the haste and confusion, the few candles which lit our way were blown out or knocked over, and I found myself alone, with 2 or 3 laggards in the deep gloom, lost in the labyrinth of galleries. If there really had been a gas attack, we could have made our acts of contrition. This mine would be our tomb. The gas would certainly sweep right through it. Luckily, this was only a false alarm, passed along in the sector as an exercise and an experiment, and soon some engineers came and found us. But almost all of the soldiers from my squad had profited from this incident by escaping all the way to the Trou Bricot. As a result, I couldn't finish the work that had been assigned to me. The pitiless officer of engineers made his report, and if I didn't lose my corporal's stripes, it was. So Lieutenant Breton, commanding the 15th Company, told me, because of my brilliant conduct on Code 304. I have already recounted my exploits there, which are far from worthy of being passed along to posterity. On August 4th at 8 in the evening, the 15th Company went up to the front line. It was almost with pleasure that we returned to the outposts. This delivered us from work in the mines and from the company of the cadaver-eating rats. On August the 6th in the evening, my squad occupied an outpost for the second time. A total calm reigned over the Champagne front, in harmony with the serenity, the sweet warmth of this summer evening. Half of the squad stood watch at the loopholes, while the other half dozed on the firing steps. To struggle with sleepiness, I did the 100 paces from the outpost to the front line, recalling that August 6th was the date of the local festival in my village. I conjured up the memory of the crowd pouring in from nearby villages, the dancing beneath the plane trees, the illuminated booths, the happy young people. All this was the image of peace. Now, back there in the village, there was no festival, no dancing. Silence, sadness, mourning and anguish had replaced joyfulness. I was brusquely pulled out of my reveries by frantic cries, which seemed to come from the neighbouring outpost to our right. "To arms! To arms!" Immediately some grenades burst, red flares lit up the sky, and in less than 5 minutes, cannon, trench mortars, bomb throwers, machine guns, everything that was in the trenches was spitting fire, lead, iron. Death was unleashed in a fury. Once the first few minutes of stupor had passed, my little rookies got control of themselves, and like madmen, threw their grenades in all directions and fired all their cartridges. So what had happened? We didn't find out until 2 days later, by reading the communiqué in the newspapers. The Germans had tried, by surprise attack, to seize some of our outposts and penetrate into our lines, in the sector of Tahur and Côte 193, without great success. But at that moment, isolated in the night in the middle of this raging storm, which reminded me of the bad days of Lorette and Verdun, and in the uncertainty of what was going on, we weren't without worries. Profiting from a relative moment of calm, two courageous Parisians volunteered to go to the section chief's dugout and the reserve squad's post. After a few minutes, they came back, terrified. "We're lost!" they cried. "The Boches are in our front line." "Shit," I said. "They're going to gobble us up right away. But did you see them or hear them?" "No, but in the emplacements of the support squad there was nobody, and everything was dumped in the middle of the boyau dishes, pots and pans, jerrycans. Who else would have tossed all that onto the ground, other than Boches passing through there? They probably took all of our guys prisoner." Indeed, these weren't reassuring signs. In case of attack, the outposts were supposed to fall back, so we abandoned our post, moving with infinite precaution, grenade or loaded rifle in hand. But here, at a turn in the boyau, by the sudden light of a flare, we saw, sticking up above the height of the boyau, glinting bayonets, and right at the angle appeared a hand brandishing a revolver. "There we go," we thought in anguish. "We've fallen in among the Boches just when we're trying to get away from them." With a strangled voice, I instinctively let out the cry, "Who goes there?" But surprise, at the same time, in a voice no less strangled with fear than mine was, the same cry burst forth in the purest Languedoc accent. "Qui vive?" Well, what do you know? It was the voice of the pastry chef from Narbonne, our adjutant Toulzane, at the head of two reserve squads. Having sought refuge in a dugout more solid than their own, at the support trench line, and worrying about our fate, they came to see what had happened to us, fearing to find the Kaiser's minions in our place. As for the trashing of our cookware, the culprit was simply a mortar round landing in close proximity. The rest of that night was agitated by bombardments and fusillades. We were in a constant state of alert, but in our case we never saw the silhouette of an enemy. 2 days later, our 6th Squad went to occupy outpost number 10. This was nothing more than a barricade in a former communication trench linking German lines. It was there that the final assault wave of the first Great Champagne offensive had ended, after the flux and reflux of the last attacks and counterattacks. 6 meters from our barricade, the Germans had established their own. A few strands of barbed wire thrown in between, which one could have crossed in 4 bounds, were all that separated the two peoples, the two races, from exterminating each other. There was even a covered passageway which reached as far as a meter from the German sandbags. From there you could have stuck out your arms and shaken hands. On learning that they were sentenced to spend 24 hours in an outpost like this, rear echelon slackers or good bourgeoisie, no matter how patriotic, would have felt their hair stand on end, and wouldn't have wasted any time making up a last will and testament before entering into this death trap. But imagine their astonishment, their stupefaction, to see the calm and tranquility which reigned in this area. Some smoked, others read, some wrote, a few squabbled, without lowering their voices one note. And if these patriots, these slackers, had lent an ear, they would have heard the Germans coughing, spitting, talking, singing, etc., with the same lack of ceremony. Their stupefaction would have changed to bewilderment if they had seen the French and German sentries seated tranquilly on their parapets, smoking pipes and exchanging bits of conversation from time to time, like good neighbours taking some fresh air at their doorsteps. From relief to relief, we passed along the habits and customs of these outposts. The Germans did the same. Even if the whole Champagne burst into flames, not a single grenade would fall in this privileged corner. During the day, I had come to reconnoitre the somewhat tangled road from this outpost, which was stuck at least 400 metres away from the place where the rest of the section was located. Our section chief found himself there in conversation with a Fritz, who spoke fairly good French. He was saying that they were mostly Poles in his regiment. They wouldn't surrender because the Germans would take it out on their families and their property. But this Pole suddenly indicated that someone was coming along the boyau, and he dropped down, calling out, "Vive la Pologne! Vive la France!" Sometimes there were exchanges of gifts, like packets of tobacco from the French government tobacco monopoly, which went to fill the big German pipes, or delicious German cigarettes which came over to the French side. We also exchanged lighters, buttons, newspapers, bread. Here was a crazy business of commerce and intelligence with the enemy, which would have stirred up the indignation of the patriots and super-patriots, From the royalist Daudet to Clemenceau, the gunman of Narbonne, by way of the chameleon Hervé. It's a matter of taste. Some will consider this sublime, others will call it criminal. It depends on whether you place the ideal of humanity above or below the ideal of patriotism. You can be sure that this gesture of fraternity occurred in more than one place, in fact wherever the proximity of outposts allowed it. And our big bosses, our leaders, had no illusions about it. If the trenches had been closer together, if they hadn't been separated by prickly barbed wire, hands would have reached out everywhere, proof among 1,000 that this horrible war had been unleashed counter to the consent of the peoples. By whose pen will the next generation, struck with stupor, disconcerted by this universal sanguinary madness, learn about these acts of fraternity, which were like a protest, a revolt against the mortal fate which set, face to face, men who had no reason to hate each other? For the honour of our generation, of civilization, of humanity, may those who follow us have the truth revealed to them. For some it will be a comfort, for others an example, a lesson, a warning about the danger of launching a new war. That same day, from the outpost of a neighbouring company, a sergeant eager for promotion saw what was happening at outpost number 10. He wanted to throw a grenade at the German sentry, who, without mistrust, stuck his head above the parapet. This sergeant was prevented by the outpost's occupants. Furious, he went off and denounced these acts to the commandant, who notified Lieutenant Breton, who was in charge of our company. He in turn called for our section chief, the ex-pastry chef Toulzan. "It appears that your section," he told him, "is up to some dirty business. They're chatting it up with the Boches, is that true?" Our adjutant, knowing that at the very least his stripe was at risk, swore that nothing abnormal was going on. But he warned me to keep my guard up for the next 24 hours that I was occupying the outpost, because it was probable that we would be closely watched by the big chiefs, who would be ferocious, pitiless, if they found us in flagrante delicto in conversation with the enemy. It's certain that a clever command could have profited from this opportunity to gain specific intelligence about the sector, the likelihood of poison gas attacks, the plans for blowing up mines or attacks or various positions. All that would be needed would be a few litres of pinard or a few quarts of hooch, which the Germans lacked to loosen their tongues. But no one would have dared suggest this to our bosses. This would have been admitting the start of fraternization with the enemy. A firing squad could well have been the response to such a suggestion. It's as if, in the time of the Inquisition, a poor fellow had confessed that he had just had a conversation with Satan. Given the incidents of the day, it wasn't without some apprehension that I took charge of this outpost, and I recommended clearly to the sentries that they not show themselves, that they not reply to calls or conversations made by our neighbours. They stay silent and vigilant. At the same time, I asked little Marcel, a Parisian as wily as a ferret, to keep a lookout to the rear, in case we ourselves were being watched. I was comforted by the presence of Périac's Paul Alpech, who as a rationer was exempt from guard duty, but who, considering the circumstances, told me that he would keep watch all night long and make sure that my recommendations were followed. An hour went by, and the summer night covered the Champagne with a darkness which heightened the clarity of the legion of stars filling the sky with their tiny, silvery pinpoints. My spirits wandered off, far from the melancholy present. I contemplated this mysterious spectacle, and I asked myself, how many stars are there? 1 billion? 10 billion? Even without counting those which you can't see, and those you can only see a hint of. And to think that, put together, all those numberless points of light give off less warmth and light than one ray of sunshine. Even the moon made them look pale and outshone almost all of them. And I told myself that all the hundreds and thousands of acts of war, of honour, of glory, which people will celebrate in the history of this monstrous war, won't have the same value as one single discovery useful to the good of humanity, or a single invention by one savant. And I had these dreams as I moved along from one group of sentries to another, stationed at every 10 paces along the boyau. Not a rifle shot disturbed the silence. In the distance you could scarcely hear the rumble of vehicles on the roads, or the huffing and puffing of the little putt-putt trains. when all of a sudden young Marcel, who was watching the French side, arrived all out of breath and warned me that an officer, Sub-Lieutenant Lorius, armed with a revolver, had posted himself 40 metres away. The whole squad was alerted. The 4 sentries who were at the end of the boyau, facing the German outpost, turned a deaf ear to the persistent whistles which a Fritz, no doubt annoyed, made to call them. Not receiving any response, he sat on the parapet with a comrade and sent pipe smoke wafting toward us, doubtless peeved at our sulky silence. 8 or 10 paces away from the group at the barricade, young P was on watch, a Gascon who was always boasting about how much more courageous he was than the others. As I passed near him, he cried out, "Corporal, the Boches, they're right there, in the wire." At the same time, he threw a grenade which I heard land with the same dull thud that a stone makes when it hits someone's shoulder or back. But either because of the clumsiness of the thrower or the bad quality of the grenade, there was no explosion. The Gascon had, I believe, in his confusion forgotten to arm the grenade by striking it on his knee or another hard part of his body. He was already grabbing for a second one, but I stopped his arm and said to him, believing that he hadn't seen anything at all, "But wait! Where are they, the Boches?" Climbing up onto the firing step, I looked across the parapet and was quite astounded to see a human form, tangled up in the mass of barbed wire, apparently crawling toward our position. To tell the truth, this nocturnal rambler could have found a more comfortable spot for his little walkabout. To come right up under the noses of the French and German sentries who could have easily seen him, he had to be either crazy or drunk. "Qui vive?" I said in a half-whisper. There was no response, but the intruder still approached, vigorously shaking the wire. Now he was only 3 paces from us. "Qui vive?" I said again, now really alarmed, as I raised my rifle to my cheek and the sentry brandished a grenade. But this time an angry voice came back. "Leave me alone. Don't worry about me." It was the voice of Sub-Lieutenant Lorius, of our company. A minute later he jumped into the trench, revolver in hand. His breath stunk of hooch, and he was in a high state of excitement. "Who threw the grenade in my face?" he said. "The sentry did his duty," I replied. "Yeah, it's true, you're right," he agreed between hiccups. "But you're lucky I didn't catch you talking with the Boches. I was ready to kill you on the spot." "Well, Lieutenant, you can see for yourself that there's nothing wrong, and that we're keeping good watch at outpost number 10. But the lieutenant worked himself up into a rage once again. "I have to kill somebody tonight. I'm going to kill a German sentry. Show me where they are." The little Gascon had the clever idea to point to a mound of earth sticking up opposite the German outpost, saying, "They're over there." The officer squinted uselessly into the darkness. Holstering his revolver, he stalked off, muttering inarticulate and incoherent phrases and threats. The rest of the night passed by for us in painful recollection of this incident, which could have had a much more tragic outcome. As daybreak approached, the Germans called out to us. There were 3 of them, including a very young fellow, with cheeks as rosy as a Fräulein, and they asked us if we had any coffee to drink. They told us that the day before, our artillery had killed 2 of their comrades, but I hastened to bring this conversation to an end. We told them about last evening's incident and said that they should keep from showing themselves, as we were being so closely watched ourselves. The Germans, deeply moved, thanked us profusely before disappearing behind their sandbags. One of them clasped one hand in the other and cried out, "Frenchmen, Germans, soldiers, all comrades, officers!" And here he raised a clenched fist. "No!" Oh, how right he was, this German. It's true that you shouldn't generalize. But how many of our officers were more distantly separated, more morally estranged from us soldiers than were the poor German devils, who were being led to the same slaughterhouse despite themselves? To the corporal who came to take my place, I recommended that he be careful. But he wasn't careful enough, because the next day he was broken in rank, an indulgence they granted from the weakness of their case against him. He had committed the crime of not firing on the German sentries who showed themselves for an instant. The day after, with my squad, I went up to occupy outpost number 9. 3 sentries stood guard at the end of a sap, which then wandered off toward enemy lines, What was the utility of these 3 sentries, stuck way out in this place where you couldn't see 10 paces in front of you? Nobody seemed to know. A little farther along in the sap, the Germans had also posted a couple of sentries. They were too far apart to carry on a conversation, but not too far apart to observe each other through the loopholes, which were simply gaps in the parapet sandbags. Little by little, both sides became more confident in the reciprocal interest of not firing upon each other, and they ended up showing themselves without challenge, exchanging a wave of camaraderie, a smile, a friendly look. Among those who haven't suffered through the crisis of the trenches, many won't be able to understand this tacit entente, this fraternity of adversaries whom they thought were always on the alert, fingers on the triggers. But they should think seriously about the fate of men whom a long, common suffering of dangers has brought together by the strength of an irresistible instinct of human nature. Isn't it true that among people facing death on a ship battered by storms and in danger of sinking under the waves, all rancours and hatreds seem to abate and disappear? Where are we on the road of human progress that we have to plead extenuating circumstances for such a natural thing? But we've gotten far from outpost number 9.5, as this emplacement of 3 sentries was designated on the sector map. During the next day, around 8 in the morning, the dreadful and dreaded Lieutenant Grouloir, or Wooden Mug, slang for hangover, came to call on us. It was he who had just surprised my successor at outpost number 10 and had him punished for the aforesaid reason.